Hello and welcome to my 3.3 Stress, Anxiety and Arousal assignment. In this assignment I'll go through two different scenarios and explain the ways that stress, anxiety and arousal are portrayed in each of these scenarios. For the scenario, the number 2 seed in college, Nick, has been struggling to play well all season. The new coach has tried to reassure him and say how good he is and how well he should be doing for the college. They've been giving extra coaching time and have been developing his game plan with new and innovative strategies. Nick is feeling nauseous before games and never seems to be able to apply the tactic in the games. He struggles to play the more precise and accurate shots, and if he makes an error his performance falls apart. Instantly, he is a grade A student, but consistently worries about his grades and spends hours doing homework. So in psychology, stress is a feeling of emotional strain and pressure. Stress can both be healthy and unhealthy for athletes, as stress is a type of psychological pain. Small amounts of stress may be desired, beneficial and even healthy to athletes depending on the scenario. Positive stress helps improve athletic performance by getting them in the zone while also playing a factor in motivation, adaptation and reaction to the environment. Lazarus from 1991 defined stress as a pattern of negative psychological states and psychological responses occurring in situations where people perceive threats to their well-being, which they may be unable to meet. As you can see in the scenario, Nick has not been playing well and has been feeling nauseous before the games, which is a clear indication that Nick is very stressed out. It also says that he is a grade A student but frequently worries about his grades, spending hours doing homework. This shows that he is a very hard worker and probably putting too much pressure on himself, causing a build-up of stress which is preventing him from playing well. There are 3 different types of stress: being calm, having little to no stress, and almost being lazy; distress, where the stress is too much and you perform badly; and eustress, where you find your optimal stress level where you play your best. Cristiano Ronaldo says that he likes living with pressure. Being one of the best footballers in the world, there will be immense pressure on you each week to perform at that top standard. So Ronaldo consistently lives in eustress, as it is where it performs best. In sports environments, some of the main causes of stress come from the pressure that is put on the athletes in the competition or the frustration, to name a few. As we can take from the scenario, Nick gets very frustrated with himself and his game falls apart when he makes an error. Different symptoms that are shown: physically, mentally, and the way the hair behaves. Somatic symptoms would be a dry mouth, increased breathing rate, and dilated pupils. Cognitive symptoms would be reduced concentration, making mistakes, and worry. We don't know if Nick has had an increased heart rates or dry mouths before games, but we do know that he has been worrying about his grades, and when he makes mistakes on the court, his game falls apart. Behavioural symptoms would be moodiness, having nervous habits, and poor personal presentation. Once again, we can't determine if Nick has been doing any of these, but I'm sure he would pick up a few nervous habits while he's stressed out. There are 4 stages to being stressed: Stage 1, situational demand; Stage 2, perception of demand by the athlete; Stage 3, stress experience; and finally Stage 4, the outcome of the stress. 2 ways this can go: where the athlete has a positive perception of the game ahead leading to eustress, meaning increased performance, or having a negative perception of the game going into distress and having their performance suffer. Nick's probably going through the second way. The stress process can go. Anxiety is emotion characterized by feelings, tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure, heart rate, or adrenal glands opening. People with anxiety disorders usually have reoccurring intrusive thoughts or concerns which would prevent them from being able to perform at peak performance, meaning they may avoid certain situations out of worry. Buckworth and Dishman from 2002 define anxiety as a negative state of worry, apprehension, or tension that often occurs in the absence of real or obvious danger. Typically, the tension felt by anxious individuals is accompanied by a heightened state of physiological arousal. Anxiety is a reaction to something that may or may not happen in the future, and will have a negative effect on the athletes in-game, as it will lead to over-arousal. Nick worries about his grades, although he is an A-grade student, which shows he may also have anxiety. This is shown with the nausea before games. He may be getting anxious about the game ahead and making a mistake. When he makes a mistake in the game, he falls apart, like I mentioned before. If he makes that one mistake, he may have anxiety of missing another shot or another pass, causing him to fall apart and play poorly. What I could take from the scenario is that Nick has trait anxiety. Trait anxiety is a personality disposition that is stable over time. It gives a person inbuilt proneness to worry like Nick does in the games, and like Nick, when he misses a shot, there'll be overreaction and you will get over-aroused very quickly, causing you or Nick to play poorly. Now, in contrast to trait anxiety, where is with you all the time. State anxiety is anxiety that occurs in the moment and will change depending on the moment you're in. It can either be cognitive or somatic. Cognitive anxiety is associated with fear of negative evaluations of performance. McNally from 2002 says that the negative expectations and concerns about one's ability to perform is the possible consequences of failure. This is related very well to Nick and how he feels in the games. After he falls apart, he's worried about what people are thinking of him, and he may lose his place at number 2 seed in college. Cognitive anxiety is brought on a person from stress and will cause a lot of worry in a person's head. Relating to Nick, he is stressed from unnecessary worry of his grades and trying to be the best, so he may also be fighting himself in his head, wanting to achieve all of the highest grades, while also being one of the best at Western's college. Somatic anxiety, on the other hand, is not the battle in the person's head. It is the physical component of anxiety. Like I've mentioned in stress, examples would be increased heart rate and blood pressure. Cognitive anxiety is what sets off somatic anxiety because your body needs to know it's anxious before it can actually show anyone that it is. Competitive anxiety is where a performer perceives a sporting situation as potentially threatening. Hackford and Schwexmegner of 1989 says the competitive anxiety usually follows patterns of subjective feelings of tension and inadequacy combined with heightened arousal of the ANS. Now you can see that Nick may find these situations threatening and he cannot control anxiety and stresses at the crucial times, which is what he needs to do to become a pro. There are many factors that affect anxiety before and during a game or competition. There is the fear of failure, which we can see is Nick is clearly scared of failing, and the fear of importance of event. You can tell that Nick is in a big game, or he will not play well. You can tell that if Nick's in a big game, he will not play well due to speculated trait anxiety. And during a competition, the interaction with others, which I feel that Nick would be okay with, and the evaluation of himself from others, it can get his brain ticking and thinking people are looking at him or not, making the game that bit harder for him. Now finally, for anxiety, the way you measure it. You can clearly see if someone's anxious. You can take questionnaires on the players, and you can also tell physiologically if they are anxious. If they are sweating or have an increased, heart rate, it's another way of figuring that out. Nick has a new coach, and he can tell he probably has trait anxiety, so he's done the right thing by reassuring him and giving him extra coaching time to try and help him improve on the court. I think what needs to happen to benefit Nick is to have time in front of crowds, so he's used to messing up in front of people without getting down and too nervous. Arousal. Arousal in the context of psychology is the state of being psychologically alert, awake, and attentive. If you are under-aroused, you will not perform at your best. If you are over-aroused, you will also not perform at your best. So finding that in-between point is crucial for players and their performance. I'll talk more on this later. Weinberg and Gold say that arousal is a blend of physiological and psychological activity in a person, and it refers to the level of motivation, alertness, and excitement at a particular moment. Arousal is a level of readiness to perform and prepares the body for action. It is also where the fight or flight response comes from. It is clear that Nick has more of a flight than a fight response to high levels of arousal, which means his performance suffers. Arousal is on a continuum from low to moderate to high. High arousal can be good in certain areas and bad in others. Same goes for low arousal. It just depends on the situation that you're in. The RAS, or the reticular activating system, is what regulates our levels of arousal. It also monitors the level of stimulation. It sends signals through a spinal cord and up to the brain to tell it whether to be aroused or not very aroused, once again depending on the situation. In a basketball game like Nick would be, he would need to be very moderately aroused when taking a free throw. He would need to be very calm and collected and in the right headspace for taking the shot, even more so if it was in the final in front of thousands of people while also being live streamed on TV. Now, for Nick, he has trait anxiety. His arousal levels in that type of situation would be through the roof because and cause him to mess up the shot. His arousal levels would also be high when stressing about his grades. This is another way to demonstrate optimal levels of arousal. You don't really want to be taking a game-winning free throw and have an underload of arousal. You probably won't be putting any effort into the shot. You don't want to have an overload of arousal either, as it can make a person like his anxiety very bad, possibly causing him to fear taking the shot or like a panic attack at the worst. Drive theory, theorized by Hull, 1951, is one of the earliest and most simple explanations of arousal. Hull said that there is a linear relationship between arousal and performance, as you can see demonstrated in this graph here. He says the higher the arousal, the better the performance. If we were to use Nick as an example here for higher arousal means better performance, we can straight away tell that Nick gets very aroused very quickly, and when he gets very aroused very quickly, his game falls apart. Meaning that this graph and theory, from what we know about Nick, is wrong. Another theory that was written by Zajonik, 1965, was a theory that was developed from Hull's theory that said the presence of others increases arousal, which brings out the dominant response. And once again, from what was been given to us, Nick doesn't seem like the kind of person that would go back to what he knows best when he's under pressure and feeling anxious after missing a shot. He's going to fall apart, as the scenario says. Drive theory is subjective to whether you are an experienced performer or an inexperienced performer. For Nick, he is a very good player. However, when he's on the court to play his game, the nerves and fear take over, preventing him from performing at his best. And this will ease with experience. Drive theory will apply more to him, and the longer he is in front of crowds or on the pitch. So drive theory is great and applies well to inexperienced players. However, on inexperienced players like Nick, it does not apply so much. The theory suggests that when you have low arousal, you perform badly or poorly. For a darts player, you would need fairly low arousal to be able to keep it still, as you need to be to gain the best advantage possible to perform your best. And the performance will be very high, because even though your arousal is fairly low. So I think drive theory applies to things like football, rugby, team sports, or inexperienced players. But that is a negative, or just a bad part about drive theory. Inverted U theory is like drive theory, but better and a broader way of measuring arousal. It basically says that everyone has their own optimal point of arousal, and as you're building up to that optimum, your performance is increasing, getting better and better, until you get to that point where you start getting over-aroused and your performance starts slipping and getting worse and worse. The more aroused you get, the relationship between arousal and performance is curvilinear. In a game of basketball like Nick would be, his arousal levels shoot past his optimal point, which is what causing him to fall apart. He needs to learn ways of coping or just getting more experience. We can go back in a couple slides and see that when you're underloaded with arousal, you're almost bored of the game and uninterested. Then on the other side, it's completely different, and you're stressed out, anxious, and scared of messing up. The criticism of the theory is that not everyone will have the same optimal point, meaning the graph will be different for everyone. The decline of performance may also not be as gradual as it is on the graph, and it only explains one optimal level of arousal needed for simple and also complex tasks. I think the theory best demonstrates in a game in game-like situations or sporting events. It is clear that if you're either over or under aroused, your performance is going to lag, but it will depend on what you're doing. Fazio and Hardy, 1988, says that performance does not always gradually decrease as arousal increases, as shown in inverted U theory. It will depend on cognitive and somatic anxiety. When they're both low, it will gradually decrease and follow back to inverted U theory. But when they're high, it follows inverted U to a certain point, but then there can be a dramatic drop, the catastrophe of the performance. When the catastrophe does occur, the arousal levels will drop, but not enough to bring you back to optimal performance, and the performer must relax in order to get arousal back below the point where catastrophe occurred. An example of this is Nick and how he falls apart when he messes up a shot. His performance decreases rapidly and needs to find a way to come back from the catastrophe by relaxing and collecting himself, ready to go again. Nidifer, 1976, argues that increased levels of arousals can cause changes in concentration and attention. He says that high levels of arousal can occur when athletes have too much information to take in. So what can happen in a rugby game, for example, is if your attention span is really open and you're not as aroused as you should be, take too much information in, take too long to make a decision, and then end up getting tackled. On the other hand, if you're too aroused, your field of view is narrower, causing the player to be less aware of the situation, but you're that fast. And do what you feel you need to do in that point in time. Overall, catastrophe theory doesn't really have many faults that have been found yet. It's hard to test, and that's really about it.